Okay, so it seems to me that among the most important distinctions that we need to make when studying these texts is the distinction between what is described in the text, the historicity of the description, as opposed to the historicity of the time of the production of the texts. Okay, and this is, of course, a big problem in Christian circles. It's also, to some degree, a big problem that we have in our own texts. When the Talmud, for example, tells us a story, tells us a midrash about something that happened to Moshe, right? The famous text in Tractate Menachot, which has Moshe going up to God and seeing God writing the crowns on the letters. And Moses says, "What are you doing, God?" And God says, "Oh, well, there's going to be this guy in 1,000 years. His name is Rabbi Akiva, and I'm doing it for his sake, because he's going to interpret these things." Okay, what do we make of this? Are we, as religious Jews, obligated to believe that this is a historical text, that literally it's just as historically true that Moses split the sea and had this conversation with God? I would say that most of us would say, no, this is a story composed by much later Jews to tell something true about the Torah, but they do it through narrative. And yet, because history and historicity is such a feature of the way that modern people think about life, there has been, in the last 400 years or so, a kind of conflation of history and theology. And so I always want, and if this sounds confusing, good, it is confusing, and I hope I'll continue to come back to these kinds of questions. But when we want to ask questions about the historical Jesus or about history involving early Christianity, we're confronted with a big problem, which is that none of the texts that we have about Jesus were written anywhere near in terms of time period when the events they describe took place. Okay? And in fact, the thing that is perhaps closest to the time of the Jesus movement is this strange passage from Josephus, okay, in Antiquities, written at some point. Remember, Josephus is the sort of Benedict Arnold of the Great Revolt. He switches sides after having been a Judean general and flips to the Romans and spends the rest of his career after the destruction of the temple essentially writing in Greek for a Roman audience to try to explain Jews and Judaism to Romans. And in this book, The Antiquities of the Jews, we find the following paragraph. About this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man, for he was one who performed surprising deeds and was a teacher of such people as accept the truth gladly. He won over many Jews and many of the Greeks. He was the Christ. He was the Messiah. And when, upon the accusation of the principal men among us, Pilate had him condemned to a cross, those who had first come to love him did not cease. He appeared to them, spending a third day restored to life, for the prophets of God had foretold these things and 1,000 other marvels about him. And the tribe of the Christians, so called after him, has still to this day not disappeared. Now, scholars are basically evenly divided about this. Some people think this whole passage is authentically part of Josephus. Again, our manuscripts of Josephus don't date to 71. They're at least a couple of hundred years later, the actual physical texts we have. Other scholars think, no, some Christian scribe copying this 200 years later thought, it's really weird that Josephus didn't write about the most important event in all of human history. Well, I'll put it in there, right? And so some scholars think this is a total forgery. And other scholars think, well, it's probably that Josephus mentions this, and yet another scribe, and this is what I've done with these sort of strike-throughs, another scribe sort of tweaked it a little bit to make it conform to the kinds of things that Christians were saying later. We have no way of knowing exactly what this is. But, of course, it gives us an interesting model, right? That it's possible that at first there are stories told about a wonder worker, a magician, a holy man. By the way, Josephus talks about 12 or 15 people who declare themselves to be the Messiah in antiquities, right? One after the other, which makes perfect sense given Jewish history and given the degree to which Roman political control was seen as a theological problem. Okay? Well, if we don't know about Josephus, or we can't, even if we could verify this, it's still incredibly small and doesn't give us much detail. We're sort of forced to turn to the texts of the New Testament. But there too, we have real problems because, as many of you are familiar with, there are 4 canonical gospels in the New Testament, that of Mark, of Matthew, of Luke, and of John. Okay? And they are remarkably different. They do not seem to have the same style. They seem to have been written in different time periods. And here's maybe the most important thing to take away from this chart. Mark is likely the earliest of the Gospels, composed sometime in the 70s. And the reason why we know this, and this is very important to keep in mind, is because Mark seems to be aware of the destruction of the temple in 70. And so please, again, remember that while we're talking about events and ideas that begin before the destruction, everything looks different after the destruction. And so we have no data before the destruction. And Mark, which is the earliest, is in the 70s. And the other 3, Matthew and Luke and John, are from significantly later even than Mark. Okay? But it gets more complicated than this, because of course, at least, and here I guess I have to make this a little bit smaller so it can all go on the screen at the same time, 3 out of the 4, Mark and Luke and Matthew, are interrelated. And this is why we call them the synoptic gospels. That doesn't make any sense. Synoptic means, right, syn means together, optic, like the, right, means to look at, that when you look at them together, and I'll show you some examples of this in a second, they look the same. And this is why most scholars believe that Mark is earlier than the other 2, and that not only is it earlier, but that both the author of Luke and the author of Matthew had Mark, or something very much like Mark, in front of them as they composed their texts. In other words, that both Luke and Matthew are sort of rewrites of Mark, and they borrow Mark's basic structure and they add things. Okay? And that's why this part in purple, right, 76% of Mark and 41% of Luke and 46% of Matthew are essentially the same. Okay? But in addition to that, okay, I'm talking about the major features, 35% of Luke is unique to Luke, and 20% of Matthew is unique to Matthew. And yet, shockingly, about a quarter of both Matthew and Luke are the same, but different from Mark. And this has led to what scholars call the 2-source hypothesis, that Matthew and Luke each is basing himself on Mark and this other source, which provides for this stuff in blue. Now, most of this material is actually things that Jesus is purported to have said, and what language that source was in. We don't have it anymore. Scholars tend to call it Q for quella, meaning quotes. German scholars in particular love inventing books and then quoting them. But it is striking that Luke and Matthew share a significant amount of material, which Mark seems not to have had, and then each of them has a bunch of material that are unique to themselves. Okay, and note, however, that at this point I haven't said anything about John. John seems totally different, and with very few exceptions, the material that is found in John does not parallel the material that's found in Mark and Luke and Matthew. Okay, so here's an example of the synoptic nature of these texts. Okay, there's a very famous story here. Okay. I'm going to read, so maybe we can play this game. I'm going to read the text as it is in Mark. But in order for you to sort of get a sense of what I'm talking about, you should try to look either at Matthew or at Luke, okay, and compare the words that are coming out of your computer screen to the words that you are focusing on, okay? And leaving the crowd behind, they
Rabbi?
Yes, go ahead.
I'm just sorry, it may be true for other people, but I've got a big gray box blocking a lot of Luke for me.
Okay.
It says alignment. Better? Thank you.
Okay. Good. Thank you for telling me. Okay. And leaving the crowd behind, they took with them in the boat just as he was. Note, of course, Mark has this strange line, other boats were with him, where the others don't have it. Okay. Luke adds, and while they were sailing, he fell asleep. Okay, but you can see that it's largely the same text. A great gale arose and the waves beat into the boat so that the boat was already being swamped, but he was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. Okay, so note that whereas Luke has him being asleep before the gale happens, it seems that Mark and Matthew, slightly differently, he's only asleep afterwards. And they woke him up and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" Okay, and here it's very important. Isn't it interesting that Matthew insists that the disciples call him Lord, Kyrios in Greek, which in fact is the same word that is used to translate Adonai, right? Meaning God. Okay, as opposed to master, slight differences which may mean something. He woke up and rebuked the sea and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." And then the wind ceased and there was dead calm. He said to them, "Why are you afraid? Have you still no faith?" And then they were filled with a great awe and said to one another, "Who then is this that even the wind and sea obey?" Okay, so despite these minor differences, you see that at core, this is probably a text that was originally in Mark, and Matthew and Luke decide, oh, that's a really important story. Now, we could say some things theologically about this. Why is this an important story? If you know anything about the Hebrew Bible, or even more importantly, the Hebrew Bible sources, right? The core Babylonian creation myth has the sea being beaten and defeated as part of creation. If you want to make a theological argument in the Near East, in the ancient Near East, the best way to do it is to depict your deity beating the sea. Okay, so it makes perfect theological sense that they would all have this, and the fact that they look the same is largely because Luke and Matthew are drawing upon Mark. Okay. Just to turn to John for a second, John's Jesus seems like a totally different character. Okay. Instead of performing feats, exorcisms, and sort of doing maybe what we would call magic or working miracles or things like that, John's Jesus goes on these incredibly long theological discourses. Do not let your hearts be troubled. Believe in God. Believe also in me. Right? The notion that Jesus is in some way God is really unique to John and does not really appear in any way in the other Gospels. In my Father's house, there are many dwelling places. If it were not so, would I have told you that I go to prepare a place for you, etc. And so we get a really different picture of the main character, right? This is the kind of thing that most Christians would be really surprised to note, because of course they tend not to read these texts as I'm presenting them to you in parallel, but if I read in part of a liturgy, right, where I read a snippet from this one day and a snippet from this one day and a snippet from this the other day, well, of course it can be harmonized into a seamless whole. Okay, but when you don't read them that way, when you compare them in this particular way, they strike you as very, very different. But it's not only the character that's different, it's the plot that's different. Okay, the itinerary in Mark is really interesting. Okay, Jesus begins, by the way, Mark has no infancy gospel. The story begins where Jesus is in his late 20s or early 30s and seems to be teaching in synagogues and preaching the end of the world. Okay, and then he goes to Jerusalem one time in his life, where he cleansed the temple, teaches on the Temple Mount, eats a final meal, is ambushed, is tried before the Sanhedrin, and is executed. And there's sort of an interesting problem here, of course. If this is really true, why would it be that someone who had never been to Jerusalem before and had no followers there could attract such a big crowd that would worry the Romans so much to execute somebody? It almost makes not much sense. Okay? So in John has Jesus going to Jerusalem all the time, right? He's in Galilee some of the time. He's in Judea more broadly. He's in Jerusalem frequently. He cleanses the temple, etc. Okay, and this itinerary, even though the character may seem shockingly different and sort of ahistorical, it may well be that John's itinerary makes more historical sense. And the reason why I point this out is to show that whereas the character Jesus from the Synoptic Gospels might more accurately reflect the historical Jesus, remember, this is not a history. Mark has created this narrative in order to forward the theological ideas that he has and makes it into a good plot, right? You need an arc, you need a climax, right? And it's a good story this way. John, who has a slightly different kind of main character, has what we might argue is a sort of more accurate historical itinerary, which would then explain that Jesus is constantly in Jerusalem, gathering more and more people who are excited to hear him, that when he shows up one Passover and thousands of people are coming out to see yet another prophet predicting the end of the world, that sort of makes some more sense. And again, what I'm trying to articulate here is that all of these authors are not creating history, right? They're not writing history. Such a thing does not exist in the first century, as I'll show you in a little bit. They're writing theologies, okay? And therefore, these authors they feel a great deal of freedom to present their material the way they wish. And I want to try to argue next time, okay, that messianism and this identification of Jesus as Messiah is part of this process that happens in the writing of these texts in the 90s or early 100s, and not so much in the 30s. Okay, there are some major differences. Okay, and especially in places where there is not a shared sense. Okay, maybe this is among the most famous sections of all of the New Testament. In fact, this is the only portion of the New Testament that is quoted in the Babylonian Talmud. Okay, we're here as part of what is depicted as the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus says, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets." It's a really interesting thing to say. Why would anybody think that someone had said that he had come to abolish the law of the prophets? Who would say that? What Jew speaking to Jews in the first century would say the Torah? And of course, that's what the law in Greek, nomos, which is normally translated as law, right, is really a translation of Torah. Okay, I don't know. In some synagogues, when you go up to have an aliyah and they have the brachot there, it says before the reading of the law, right? The law means the Torah. Okay, why would anybody say, "Don't think I have come to abolish the law"? Okay, this likely is not historically accurate to the 30s. This is likely a product of a much later controversy within early Christianity. We know full well that Paul, whose letters are also collected in the New Testament, believes explicitly that Gentile Christians need not be circumcised, don't have to keep kosher, don't have to keep Shabbat, etc. And clearly there is dispute about this fact in the early Christian communities, where some Christian communities, like those that Paul is talking to, think that you don't have to be Jewish to be Christian. Whereas other early Christians think that being Christian is the best way to be Jewish, or is the right way to be Jewish. Okay, so Matthew here, who says, "I have come not to abolish but fulfill For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not one letter, not one stroke of a letter will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Okay, clearly this is what we call a polemic. This is evidence of a dispute within early Christian communities. And whoever is writing Matthew is putting the ideas of his own community into Jesus's mouth. Their community thinks, of course, we accept Jesus as, well, it's not quite clear what Matthew thinks Jesus is or who thinks Jesus is, but it's very clear that Matthew thinks that to be Christian is to be a frum yid, right? That you have to keep the Torah in order to be a Christian, and knows full well that there are other Christian communities which don't feel that way. And once again, we then need to think about this as historians. We have to think about this not as a product of the year 32, right? And if we were going to get into our DeLoreans and take our time machine back to the year 32, would we see Jesus saying this? Almost certainly not. But if we were to put the time machine a little bit later and to come into the year 100, let's say, what we might see is a variety of different early Christians arguing with each other about how to be Christian. And therefore, whereas the Gospels themselves might not always be such a good source for studying the history of Jesus and the earlier followers, if we read them in the right kinds of ways, they might be wonderful sources for teaching us about the history of the early church, okay, maybe 60 years, 70 years after Jesus is crucified. Okay? This synoptic stuff comes up in all kinds of other ways. Okay, and here, I think I always have a wonderful time juxtaposing texts from what we think of as two communities, but frequently we'll see that they are, in some sense, doing the same kinds of things. Ironically, the only place in the Torah in which divorce is spoken of is in the strange prohibition in Deuteronomy 24, a prohibition of remarrying a man's ex-wife who, after having been divorced from husband number one, is married to husband number two, and then is divorced from husband number two, or husband number two predeceases her. Then the Torah says you can't go back and get married to husband number one again. Okay, why? Well, it's unclear, but there it says, Ki kach ish isha u'va'ala, when a man marries a woman and begins having sex together, v'haya im lo timsachem be'einav, and she doesn't please him, he matzah ba ervat davar, because he finds some erva in her. Erva literally means nakedness, so exactly what that means is totally unclear. V'chatav la sefer kritut, then he writes for her a sefer kritut, which we call a get. V'natan bi'ada, and he gives it into her hand. V'shilcha mi beito, and he sends her away from his home. So there's a dispute in the Mishnah. We'll start with the Mishnah. Okay, what does this mean? Okay, what does it mean? So Beit Shammai says no man shall divorce his wife unless he found in her unchaste behavior. What's the Torah talking about? What's the reason for divorce? If she slept with somebody else, if she cheated on him, then he can divorce her. How does he know? As it says, he finds something obnoxious of her. He finds her an ervat davar. And for those of you who know biblical Hebrew, the arayot, erva, is that classic word which is used to think about all sexual improprieties. So Beit Shammai read the word erva there to mean adultery. Okay? Whereas Beit Hillel says, no, even if she spoiled his food, it could be nothing. By the way, this is somewhat misogynist text in which women are things to be kept or disposed of, right, in deeply problematic ways. This is not really the topic of the class, but I just want to note that. Okay, Beit Hillel thinks no, he doesn't need to have a good reason to divorce her. Why? He finds something obnoxious. He says Beit Hillel doesn't focus on the ervat davar, the unchaste thing. He focuses on the word davar, thing, could be anything. This is true that one example of a bad thing is adultery, but it doesn't have to go that way. Okay? And Rabbi Akiva is even more permissive. It says even if he found somebody prettier than her, right? Deeply problematic from our perspective, I think. As it is stated, she fails to please him. From a midrashic perspective, Rabbi Akiva says, no, don't neither Beit Shammai, who are focusing on the word erva, nor Beit Hillel, who are focusing on the word davar, neither of them is reading the pasuk correctly. You should read, right? Im lo timsa chen be'einav, she didn't please him. So it could be any reason whatsoever. Well, to some degree, we see a similar kind of dispute within the Gospels. Matthew's Jesus says, but I say to you that anyone who divorces his wife, except on the grounds of unchastity, causes her to commit adultery. Note that Matthew's Jesus and Beit Shammai have precisely the same opinion. Matthew's Jesus and Beit Shammai read Devarim exactly the same way. So again, it's probably not really somebody in the first century. It's probably someone in the second century, not that long before the Mishnah is collected, expressing the precise same view of Beit Shammai. And yet in Mark and in Luke, we don't have this exception. Whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery. And this may be a more familiar, certainly Catholic, but more broadly Christian perspective that divorce is now illegal. Post-Jesus, there's no such thing as divorce. Sheila, just unmute yourself first.
Are we then to assume that Matthew read some Mishnah?
Well, read almost certainly not, because the
So that's
Mishnah
right,
really
because it
doesn't
wouldn't
get
have been
written down
yet.
Right. Whether it's the Mishnah, it would strike me as very unlikely that learned Judeans in the first century did not know a variety of ways of thinking about divorce. We have Gittin, right, from Tel Amarna and from the Bar Kokhba letters, right? We know that Gittin are being written around this time period. So there's the thing called divorce. Exactly when and how, etc., one can do that is certainly a matter of significant dispute. I think it's probably less likely that somehow Matthew is dependent on the Mishnah. It's more that both of these are reflecting live opinions of how to interpret the Torah in the first century. Yes, Taibo.
When you just said the Amarna letters, and
Yes.
archaeology is something I only have a superficial knowledge, but my recollection is that Amarna covered a vast swath of the region.
Yes.
So, okay, so yes, it's like not a stele that was found in one place or something.
Right.
So do you happen to know which geographically where the letters were either found or seem to apply about divorce?
I don't know off the top of my head, but I do know the Gittin have been found all over the place from long before the rabbinic period. Tubot as well. You know, and unfortunately, fortunately, sometimes these are documents which are dated, right? And so that sometimes you actually can get a real live date, but I don't know off the top of my head. I'm not quite sure how much it matters, right? Because we don't know where Matthew was written. We don't know where in the Galilee the Mishnah was first collected. But certainly the ways in which people are interpreting Deuteronomy these are live opinions. Yeah, Elliot.
Yes, and I checked in a bit late, so I'm not sure if you covered this or not, but I'm curious to know how many of the four gospel writers were contemporaries of Jesus. How many of these four actually met him and knew him well?
Zero,
because I've read some conflicting reports about that. One said that they did, with the exception possibly of Luke. So I don't know what the real story is. Does any human being ever know, living today or centuries ago, know who the real Jesus was?
Well, so this is exactly what I'm trying to set up, which is no, of course not. To some degree, we will never have an accurate perspective. I'm trying to take a middle path, which is instead of saying we can know nothing, and therefore let's just throw up our hands and study something else, or those that is sort of a more fundamentalist Christian approach, which insists against all evidence to the contrary. These are no, these are eyewitnesses' account. I suspect that these are based on oral traditions, especially, and you did miss this piece, but the source that both Matthew and Luke seem to be relying on, some kind of collection, whether it was written or oral, we don't know, of things the master said. I suspect some of those are likely authentic, and this is probably a good example of them. Is it likely that Jesus of Nazareth taught a less permissive approach to divorce than other Jewish sects in the first century? Yeah, it's probably true. But of course, we don't know exactly. And this is what I'm really trying to emphasize, trying to disentangle what might be authentic from the 30s to what really comes into play as a result of what has happened or not happened in the 70 years later. That's probably what is accounting for many of the features of the Gospels as we know them. Okay, so instead of reading this as 6 opinions, right? If really Matthew's Jesus is really just like Beit Shammai, it's really just 4 opinions, right? Good. So I see another couple of hands are raised. Sheila, was that you again?
Yeah,
Yeah.
something's going crazy there. Where does Paul fit in?
Good. So Paul is much earlier. Okay, Paul's conversion at some point is in the 40s, and his later letters. Paul does not live past the destruction. Paul dies, is martyred, as they say, before the temple is destroyed. So in many ways, Paul's letters are far earlier, far closer in time to the early Jesus movement than the Gospels. Of course,
was he alive? Was Paul alive when Jesus was alive?
Yes, but was not part of the movement until after Jesus's death.
Because isn't Paul considered the founder of Christianity in a certain sense?
Depends what you mean by is considered, by whom.
Okay.
Right, and he certainly is the founder of a Christianity, and certainly from the perspective of history, once Paul's letters are collected into the New Testament and harmonized with the Gospels, yes. But for example, the passage I just read to you from Matthew, right, about the law being in force, Paul doesn't think that. Paul would disagree with that. To some degree, Matthew's text may well be responding to the kind of communities that Paul is talking to, and etc. Yeah, Elliot, go ahead.
Yeah, didn't Paul have some sort of vision or dream or whatever on the way to Damascus? And I wonder about this off-quoted statement about Jesus saying, what goes out of your mouth is more important than what goes into it. Was he denying the importance of keeping kosher?
So this is a big question. Once again, so those are 2 good questions, which I'll answer in turn. First of all, we have 2 sources for Paul, because of course, unlike the other Gospels, Luke has a sequel. The author of the Gospel of Luke writes a part 2, which is what we now call the Acts of the Apostles. And among the main characters in the book of Acts is Paul. However, there's a lot of narrative about Paul in Acts which contradicts what Paul says about himself. So once again, we have to sort of disentangle these literatures from later histories. And what you quote, which is in the Synoptics and is in Mark, about what goes into your mouth and what goes out of your mouth, these again may be intra-Christian polemics precisely about what you're asking about. And so what I'm trying to encourage people to say and to think is not, did Jesus think X? But to ask the question, what did early Christian communities think about X? Okay? Because knowing exactly what Jesus did say or didn't say, we really have no data about these kinds of questions. Okay, let me give you an example here where we see a synoptic passage which has editions both of Luke and of Matthew. Okay, so you will see that we have a little bit later on this triumphal entry into Jerusalem and going into the temple. Okay, so there's this core piece in Mark here I have in the middle, right, which is then expanded in two different ways. Okay, so in Luke, Luke adds this thing before he goes to Jerusalem. Some of the Pharisees in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, order your disciples to stop," okay, etc. And he then says to them, "If you, even you, had only recognized on this day the things make for peace, but now they are hidden from your eyes. Indeed, the days will come upon you when your enemies will set up ramparts around you and surround you and hem you in on every side." Luke is totally aware of something that Jesus couldn't have known about, right? Which is that 40 years after this is supposed to take place, the Romans besiege Jerusalem and destroy the temple. And Luke is making a theological argument here, and of course, to make an argument in your own time, the most compelling way to make your argument to your other people in your group is to say, Jesus himself said that Jewish rejection of Jesus would lead to the destruction of the temple and replacement of ethnic Jews with Gentile Christians. Okay, Luke is a gospel which seems to be written for and by Gentile Christians, non-ethnic Judeans. Okay, and note, this is not present in Mark, which is likely the source text, nor in Matthew, which, as we've seen, is directed towards Jewish Christians. Okay, note what Matthew adds, right? Who is this? This is the prophet Jesus from Nazareth in Galilee. Okay. And he also adds, but when the chief priests and the scribes saw the amazing things that he did and heard the children crying out in the temple, "Hosanna to the Son of David," the first time we may have seen a kind of messianism here. Okay, something that, again, if this were really historically true, if when Jesus showed up in Jerusalem and everybody said, "Yay, the Messiah is here," don't you think that both Mark and Luke would have reported it? Right? The fact that they don't strikes me to mean that maybe Matthew has added, they ought to have recognized what I now am arguing they should recognize. And Jesus then quotes the Psalms in Matthew to say, "Do you hear what these are saying?" Jesus said to them, "Yes, have you never read, out of the mouths of infants and nursing babies you have prepared praise for yourself?" Okay, so both Luke and Matthew are adding pieces, are composing sections to forward and to convince their audiences of their theological claims. Okay, among the major questions, of course, is ultimately, what were early Christians thinking about the temple? Okay, and this famous act, right, where Jesus goes into the temple, right, entered the temple, I'll read again from Matthew, and drove out those who were selling and buying in the temple. By the way, it's a normal part of temple business. It's pretty hard to find an animal without a moom, right? An unblemished animal. Makes perfect sense to have your sacrificial animals, which have been pre-vetted with a good hechsher, right, for sale there. Okay, so exactly what is going on is an interesting question. Mark has actually a little bit more data, okay? Or Mark and Matthew have a little bit more data about selling doves, right? And the money changers, etc. And he would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. That's interesting. Okay, and quoting Isaiah, it is now written, Beiti Beit Tefillah Yikareh L'chol Ha'amim, right? My house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations. Okay, well, now note in John has the same basic scene, but with all kinds of different details. Right? Making a whip of cords. He drove them out of the temple, both the sheep and the cattle. That's a piece of data doesn't exist in the synoptics. He also poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. He told those who were selling doves, take these things out of here, stop making my father's house a marketplace. His disciples remembered that it was written, zeal for your house will consume me. Okay, so this is a very interesting sort of key. It's only in later generations that these communities mine the Bible for proof texts about him. This is not something that's going on in the moment. It's only something that's happening that people are retrojecting from a later period. Okay, and yet again, John seems to know about the destruction. Destroy this temple in 3 days, I will raise it up. Okay, this temple has been under construction for 46 years, and you will raise it up in 3 days. But he was speaking of the temple of his body. It's very interesting. Okay, John has this radical theology, which can only make sense after the temple has been destroyed, which is that Jesus is the temple, right? Post Jesus, there's only one sacrifice that matters, and this whole narrative of Jesus being the Lamb, right, is something that could only come into play as a response to the destruction. In some ways, it's a kind of parallel argument that the Mishnah makes. Right? You ever wondered why the Mishnah is constantly talking about the temple as if it still stood? Right? Read Tractate Yoma sometime when you're bored next year on Yom Kippur, right? During the endless chazanis of the piyut repetitions that nobody understands. Nobody understands them, right? So read the Mishnah at that point. You'd think that the temple was still standing. Right? And then the Kohen Gadol does this, and then he does that, and then the sages tell him, no, don't do it this way, do it that way, all kinds of details. Right? The Mishnah seems to suggest that it's true, the real temple doesn't exist, but it's as if it exists. Right? We can sort of keep alive the idealized temple in study, and if we study the laws of the temple and imagine it happening, well, that's sort of as if it still existed. Right? Whereas John's theology is radically different. We don't need the temple anymore because there's only one sacrifice that matters. Again, these are not ideas that would have made any sense in the 30s because there's a temple, go right there. And just 1 second, Sheila, right? The book of Acts is full of descriptions of these early Christians going and offering sacrifices in the temple, because of course you offered sacrifices in the temple. That's what being a Judean is going to the temple to offer sacrifices. Go ahead, Sheila.
Is it possible that the Mishnah dwells on, in Yoma, that they dwell on all these things about the temple in response to something like this, to the New Testament?
Seems unlikely to me, because it sure takes a while for the rabbis to know enough about Christianity as a sort of non-Jewish or non-rabbinic movement enough to say nasty things about it. So we get almost there really is no reference to Jesus or to Christians in the Mishnah. There's maybe one in the Tosefta, in which somebody wants to whisper a spell over a snake bite in Jesus's name, right? That may be a sort of healing. And Rabbi Yishmael, who lives in the 130s, a little bit before then, won't let this man whisper Jesus's name over a snake bite. That's the one thing in the Tosefta. And in the Yerushalmi, right, in the 300s and the early 400s, you begin to see more references. And in the Bavli, many, many more. But it would seem unlikely to me just because it takes so long for any kind of community to sort of gain the kinds of numbers, to sort of be a threat to the rabbinic movement. So I think it's unlikely. I think it's unlikely. Okay. And so now maybe I want to give you the sort of a teaser to what I want to do next week, which is, how might we read this idea of messianism as a product of this second or third generation of Christians? Okay, well, where would we start looking for this? And it makes sense, given that it was just Christmas, right, to think about the birth narratives of Jesus of Nazareth. And as I mentioned sort of in passing above, Mark, who I've included just for fun, Mark says nothing about Jesus's childhood whatsoever. Luke has another sort of Jesus at 6 or 7, gets into interesting arguments in the temple. Okay, but we can see from both an infancy narrative in Matthew and an infancy narrative in Luke that both Matthew and Luke, writing, let's say in the year 100, are confronted with a basic problem. By their time, everyone is arguing that among the ways that Jesus must be understood is as the Messiah. Okay, so think back to what we did last week, right? What is it to be the Messiah? Okay, well, it has something to do with being anointed. Okay, it has something to do with the temple, and we have a lot of interesting temple stuff going on here. But maybe more importantly than anything else, we have this notion of the messianic king, right? King Saul is anointed, and it's his anointedness and his status as Messiah which allows him to be the political and military ruler of the Israelites. And that's exactly what King David is. He is the political military ruler who builds the temple, who defends the Jewish people, who exerts Jewish sovereignty over the land of Israel. And that this covenant with David means that in order to be the legitimate king of Israel, you have to be a descendant of King David from the tribe of Judah. And if you're a descendant of King David, it would make sense that you live, or at least come from, your ancestral home is in Bethlehem in Judah. Okay? This is one of the basic requirements of being King David's great-great-great-great-great-grandson, especially in a world in which the biblical assumption is that people don't move from their ancestral homes. Right? If you take the law of Shemitah seriously, everybody goes back to their ancestral home place every 50 years. And therefore, anybody who has a claim, I'm the Messiah, listen to me, must obviously come from Bethlehem. Okay, well, we got a problem. Okay, because we know full well, where is it, right? This is the prophet Jesus from Nazareth in Galilee. Jesus doesn't come from Bethlehem. It's right there in his name. He's Jesus of Nazareth. Not only does he not come from Bethlehem, he doesn't come from from Judea at all. He's a Galilean, right? And so we have this core historical problem. How is it then? By the way, this doesn't seem to bother anybody in the year 30. That guy can't be the Messiah. He comes from the north. What kind of Messiah comes from the north? That's not where Messiahs come from. Big deal, right? No, this doesn't seem to bother anybody at that point, because it would seem that the core historical claim that Jesus is making has nothing to do with messianism. Right? It may be that there's in a world of messianic speculation that there are people speculating, oh, maybe he's the Messiah. Oh, wouldn't that be great, right? But at core, Jesus does not seem to be proclaiming himself as the Messiah. Okay, is he predicting the end of the world? Probably. Is he predicting the overthrow of the Roman government? Almost certainly. That's the kind of thing that gets you killed by the Romans. Is political claims about the empire, right? Not about messianism or anything like that. Okay, but 70 years later, when early Christian communities have already decided it must well be that Jesus is the Messiah, both Matthew and Luke have a problem that needs a solution. How do I get a guy we all know comes from Nazareth to be from Bethlehem? And they each have radically different solutions.
Rabbi, this is Cheryl
Yes,
Bellamy.
go ahead, please.
I don't know if you can answer this, but I understood that Paul could not convert the Jews, and because he himself was a Greek citizen, he turned to the Greeks. And from there, they became the Christians that he saw or he proclaimed to be.
Right.
He rejected. Pardon me? Is that true?
Well, so again, is it true? We can't know 100%. And the other thing is, I want to encourage you not to have such a firm line between Jew and Gentile, right? In those days, as in our own days, things get messy at the borders, right? I suspect in all kinds of synagogues, there are people whom the rabbi doesn't consider Jewish, who they themselves do consider themselves Jewish, right?
Okay, right.
And we know from Josephus, again, this is a roundabout way to answering a very, very good question and a really important question, right? We know from Josephus that there are all kinds of non-ethnic Judeans who have sort of attached themselves to Jewish communities.
Right.
Now, in antiquity, there is a very fine line, right, between being circumcised. Well, I guess it's true today, except we tend not to prance around naked as much as they did in Hellenistically infused culture, right? Everybody, if we were to still do the Olympics naked, you'd know exactly which men were circumcised and which weren't, right? It'd be on TV. And there seem to be many, many, many uncircumcised men who are sort of attached to Jewish communities. Now, might they be keeping the Sabbath? Might they be refraining from pork? Might they be reading the Bible in the Septuagint or listening to Greek sermons? Probably. So that when Paul says he's going to the Gentiles, right? Well, lots of people are going to the Gentiles, right? There are plenty of rabbinic Jews too who are speaking to non-ethnic Judeans in their environments. So the fact that Paul is focusing on these people, I don't think we should view as a sort of hard either or. Certainly Paul conceives of himself as somebody who is bringing a more universalistic message beyond the tight ethno-nationalist community of Judea. But is that because the Jews didn't take? Well, we don't know, right? It's certainly before the destruction, Jesus's own family is running the church in Jerusalem, and we know this from the book of Acts. They refuse to eat meals, right? With Paul's Gentile people because of all of the issues of Tuma and Tohara, of cleanliness and uncleanliness, right? Which seems to suggest that there are a whole bunch of Christians who are Jewish Christians, right? And the fact that they too die in the Great Revolt, and that church is almost totally wiped out in Jerusalem, along with everybody else in Jerusalem, means that it's sort of an accident of history that the Gentile church remains, whereas the Jewish church doesn't. But again, we don't really know. And I would encourage everybody not to have such sort of hard and fast rules. Did Paul do this? We don't really know. And anyway, what Paul says he did, right? Think about Paul as somebody, as a politician on the campaign trail, right? What's his name? I'm not comparing, not Lahavdil, but what's his name? Soros said a whole bunch of things, right? That turned out not to be true at all. People say all kinds of things in public to enable their message to be heard, which it's very hard to know.
So basically, if I can sum up what you had said so far, is that you want us to see them writing their own history, correct?
Very much.
Very much. What fascinates me, and I am assuming that they must have understood, and they're Jews, understood the Talmud and the Mishnah in some ways.
Because the Mishnah and the Talmud are much later. All of these texts are long before. The Mishnah is promulgated around the year 220, right? At least 120 years after Matthew. And the Talmud is not promulgated until the 500s. So they did not know the Mishnah, they did not know the Talmud. They may know some of the same kinds of traditions, early traditions, which make their way into the Mishnah and into the Talmud. But this is, I'll let you finish in just one second, but I want to say this is very, very important. We're very accustomed to thinking that Judaism is earlier than Christianity. In some sense, it's exactly the opposite. Right? If what we mean by Judaism is rabbinic Judaism, the core texts of rabbinic Judaism are far later than the core texts of Christianity.
All right, so I have to get my timeline correct, but what fascinates me is that they are quoting Luke, the prophets.
Absolutely.
That fascinates me.
Among the things that makes a Judean is an appeal to biblical texts. Okay. And this is exactly what I'm trying to show you. The texts we saw last time about King David and where King David comes from, right? Those biblical ideas. Right. You cannot make an argument in the ancient world about how best to be Jewish without attempting to situate your ideas as the right way to read the Bible. And this is exactly what's going on here. Okay, in those days, a decree went out from Emperor Augustus that all the world should be registered. Of course, we have no evidence of this. This was the first registration and was taken while Quirinius was governor of Syria. This is going to be very important for our dating. All went to their own towns to be registered. Joseph also went, Jesus's father, or stepfather, if you want, also went from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea, to the city of David called Bethlehem, because he was descended from the house and family of David. Okay, so Luke's version of this is, why does Jesus come from Nazareth? Because his good Bethlehemite Judean father moved there. Okay, he went to be registered with Mary, to whom he was engaged and who was expecting a child. It happened to be census time, so they had to go back to their ancestral village. She happened to be pregnant, and oops, while they were there, the time came for her to deliver her child. Okay, so why is Jesus from Nazareth, even though he was born in Bethlehem? He was really a Judean. He was born in Bethlehem because his parents went back during this census of Quirinius to be registered there. That's a good answer to a textual problem. How do I get my Galilean prophet born in Bethlehem? Okay. Matthew has a radically different solution to this problem. In the time of King Herod, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judah, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem saying, "Where is the child who had been born king of the Jews," etc. Okay, when King Herod heard this, he was frightened, and all Jerusalem was with him. So he said, right, kill all the babies in Bethlehem. Okay, so an angel of the Lord appealed to Joseph in a dream and says, run away, go to Egypt. But when Herod died, an angel of the Lord suddenly appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt and said, get up and take the child and his mother and go to the land of Israel. Okay. But when he heard that Archelaus was ruling over Judea in place of his father, he was afraid to go home. And being warned in a dream, he went away to the district of Galilee. There he made his home in a town called Nazareth. Okay. So you can see, and I've made it into a little chart here, Joseph's hometown in Matthew is Bethlehem. Joseph's hometown in Luke is Nazareth. When did this happen? They happened 10 years apart. Right? Matthew and Luke disagree by 10 years as to when Jesus was born. Whether it's 4 BCE here is about when Herod dies, or Quirinius, just wait 1 second, let me finish this and then I'll take questions. Okay, the reason for his birth in Matthew, he's escaping from Herod. Okay, and we have this tax in Luke. And why is Jesus of Nazareth? That's where they go after they get back from Egypt, as opposed to that's where they come from. And I just want to, I'll take lots of questions in a second. I just want to read this quote from Paula Fredrickson, who makes this point better than I could ever do. These two very different yet similar birth narratives also give us the measure of these evangelists' literary freedom. This is an extremely important point to bear in mind. It holds true for all of our narrative New Testament texts, both for all 4 of our Gospels and certainly for Acts. These writers were not doing history, certainly not as our modern discipline, born in the Renaissance, is conceived. They were not consulting archives that preserved historical records of Jesus' birth. None existed. They were not critically assessing various materials and interviewing different people in search of a plausible reconstruction of what might actually have happened. Quite the opposite. These authors were unconstrained by any historical knowledge. They were therefore free to allow the scriptures to generate the biographical data on Jesus that they needed, right? If I want to know if I've already decided that Jesus is the Messiah, well, then I know where he has to be born, so all I have to do is write it. Okay? Their purpose in writing was not to preserve memories or to relate a plausible history. It was to persuade their hearers about the messianic identity of their protagonist. The Gospels, first of all, are proclamations, not histories. The evangelist's only constraint was the biblical tradition itself. David the king had come from Bethlehem. Therefore, somehow, Jesus had to come from Bethlehem too. And so they each wrote up a story deferring to select biblical passages that conformed Jesus's past to their own current convictions about him. Okay? And so I think we need to really be careful about how we're reading these texts. They're not histories. They're theologies written, 70 years after the fact, and are therefore composed in that way. Yes, Tybone.
Two sets of questions. One is, I know it wasn't a big focus, but I just got interested. When Luke said that Mary and Joseph weren't married.
Yes.
Is that something that all the Gospels say?
Well, Mark says nothing and John says nothing. Matthew does have an interesting, Matthew, who knows a little bit more about what we would think about as Jewish law, insists, and you can see this in the end of chapter 1 of Matthew, insists that this was after Kiddushin, but before Nisuin. And of course,
interesting.
In a wedding, do these things together. But in Talmudic times, Mishnaic times, Kiddushin, the actual giving of the ring, which then forbids the wife to sleep with anybody else, right? Happened about a year before the couple started living together, which would give the man enough time to get the house together, etc. So let me finish the thought. So after Kiddushin, she's not allowed to sleep with anybody else, but he can't yet sleep with him. And that's why, according to Matthew, makes perfect sense. Joseph thinks, well, she's clearly cheated on me if she's pregnant, because I know we haven't had sex. How else does a person get pregnant, right? So this notion of not being married yet, again, does conform. So it would seem that they do have these traditions. Go ahead.
And then, are there churches? There's the joke. You may know the short version is, actually, it's not a joke. I think it's an anecdote about a legislator years ago rising in the Texas legislature to—
English was good enough for Jesus Christ. It's good enough.
Exactly. That's where I'm going. I forget which reporter reported it. But are there churches who part of their doctrine believe that any of the gospels are contemporaneous? Yes.
I think most evangelicals, certainly traditionalist Catholics, but
wait, traditionalist Roman Catholics?
Well, when I say traditionalists, I mean those who are now considered extremists and not who the official position of the Roman Catholic Church is to embrace historical critical scholarship, not unlike the way the conservative movement embraces historical critical scholarship. In fact, the late Pope Benedict wrote a whole book, a critical historical analysis of the Gospels. When I say traditionalist, I mean, apostate Catholics, those, like Mel Gibson, those types.
Oh, got it. Because you say traditionalist, I think
so those
I think Jesuit. I think Jesuit for traditionalist. No, okay.
No, the current Pope is a Jesuit. So certainly, but evangelical Protestants will argue that the Gospels are eyewitnesses. They are not. They cannot be. They're written in Greek. The people that are depicted in these accounts don't seem to know any Greek. They're speaking in Aramaic. This is yet another thing which gives us some sense that source that Matthew and Luke share, that Mark, right, it's probably an Aramaic source, and there are all kinds of Aramaisms that crop up in this Greek. But these are texts produced by Greek speakers for Greek speakers. Plenty of Jews in that time period were Greek speakers. Just think of Philo of Alexandria. But these are texts which are written for people and by people who stand at some remove from the events depicted. And when they consult the Bible, they're consulting the Greek Bible. They're consulting the Septuagint translation of the Bible. This is certainly the version of the Bible that Paul is dealing with. It's a little bit more complicated in Matthew, and it may well be that Matthew has been sort of reworked to conform to the Septuagint, but may initially have been composed for an audience who was reading the Bible in Hebrew. Elliot, I saw you had your hand up again. Maybe I'm wrong.
Yes. Anyhow, I have some very, very close friends who regrettably are so-called Messianic Jews. We've talked with them for years, and they talk about, the issue of the blood sacrifice, and so forth. But what I tell them is, we go directly to the boss. We go directly to Hashem. We don't need an intermediary. And what they come back is, what about the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur who goes into the Holy of Holies? Is he not an intermediary? What would you say to these people?
So I think I probably have controversial opinions about this. I think it's really an accident of history that most Jewish communities feel that so-called Messianic Jews are more of a threat to us than are other kinds of Jews we disagree with. It is remarkable that the degree of pluralism that we Jews are willing to accept. We consider ourselves in the same right that the ethical humanists and Chabad Lubavitch are in the same religion, right? That's a really big spectrum, and the fact that we consider the Christian Jews to be beyond the pale somehow, I think is very interesting. I'm not advocating for change. I just want us to notice that all kinds of pluralisms have their boundaries, and where you decide to draw that line to some degree is political as opposed to theological. I'm not, again, I am my beef with Messianic Jews is simply about the Messianism. I don't think the Messiah has come yet. Right. And anyway, if the Messiah had come, how come there's no temple, and how come there's war and poverty and cancer and all kinds of other kinds of things? So intermediary, non-intermediary, there are plenty of Jews who have an intermediary. Think about all those Jews who go to Uman every year. Well, I guess not this year because there's a big war there now. But the notion that if you go to Rabbi Nachman of Bratzlav's grave, that he will serve as an intermediary for you and get you into heaven. Well, there's plenty of intermediariness in Hasidism, for example, and to some degree in Lithuanian yeshiva style culture as well. So I'm not quite sure that theological distinction is the one that you must agree or disagree about. And from an ideological perspective, given what I've said about Matthew, for example, that the Gospel of Matthew was largely composed by Jews for Jews who had some kind of messianic conception of Jesus. Well, if that was a live theology in the first century, doesn't necessarily offend me that should be a live theology in the 21st century, as long as they're not converting me by the sword. I'm an American pluralist and think that a variety of different religious approaches are fine. And I don't see why we can't be nice and staff the soup kitchens together and things like that.
Any comments, Rabbi, about the book by Daniel Boyarin,
Yes.
Jewish Gospels?
Sure.
Any comments about that book? I have it.
It's a very good book. I mean, Boyarin has written a great deal about early Christianity. He's written books about Paul. And makes a very, very compelling point. Okay. Which will sound crazy when I say it this way, but I think is quite true, is that he articulates that both Judaism as we know it and Christianity as we know it are 4th century religions. 4th century. Why is that? 2 reasons. One, because Judaism, we think of Judaism as coming under the category of religion, right? But if you look at ancient texts, the binary, right? Judaism is in a binary with Christianity. There are 2 religions. Either I'm Jewish or I'm Christian. The way to be non-Jewish is to be Christian. The way to be not Christian is to be Jewish. If you look, for example, in the book of Maccabees, the opposite of Judaismus in Greek is Hellenismus. The opposite of Judaism is Hellenism. Whatever Hellenism is, it's not a religion. It's a national cultural identity. It's all the things that make a Greek Greek, that you, God forbid you'd be circumcised, that you like to run around naked in the gymnasium, that you like to argue about philosophy, that you eat particular kinds of things, that you speak Greek, and that Judaism is all those things that make you Judean, that you speak a particular language and you eat certain kinds of foods. And yes, you worship a god in a place and offer sacrifices in a particular way, but that's one of many things that makes you Judean. And Boyarin argues that sort of in the wake of the destruction of the temple and the rise of Christianity, which has this new notion where they apply to themselves a strange Roman Latin word, religio, because they're not a cultural, ethnic group, they're a theological group. Christianity in many ways is the world's first religion. If you want a contemporary notion, the fact that we constantly talk about Hinduism as if it were a religion, well, Hindu is just Hindi, right? Isn't that interesting? For India, right? So to be Hindu means all the things that make you Indian. Indian food, Indian dress, Bollywood, etc. The fact that we say that some aspects of what it means to be Hindu, part of the Hindustani culture, we call that religion. That's because we Western people are using a category which derives from the West and Christianity, and we map it out onto the rest of the world. So it's really only when Constantine, the emperor, converts to Christianity and insists on converting the empire to Christianity, that Christianity becomes this dominant force in the world, and Jews in some ways redefine themselves and who they are on that model. Aha, we're a religion, just like they're a religion, we're a religion. But before that period, right, there are no distinctions. This notion of Jewish and Christian as sort of poles, that you can only be one and not the other, doesn't make a lot of sense. And so Boyarin's claim is that before the 4th century, there's no such thing as a fine line between Jew and Christians. There's a spectrum, there's a big messy soup. And therefore he's arguing that we should read these texts not as Christian texts, as non-Jewish texts, but as part of a spectrum, that it's only in retrospect that we call one Jewish and one Christian. I think what I just did tonight with the 3 passages from Tractate Gittin and the 3 sections from the Gospels would support his theory very nicely. That in many ways you can read the Gospels as Jewish texts talking about Jewish ideas if you want to engage with them in that way. Happy to take other questions.
I have one question again. This is Cheryl Bellamy.
Cheryl, go ahead.
You were speaking about, well, let me just say what I felt. When I went to Israel in 2019, we went to Safat. And we went to some of the places, and I was not comfortable praying over a grave. And first of all, I wanted to know if that place is really authentic, number one. Number two, it's kind of reminds you of the Catholicism of idol worship in a way. But, I'm not trying to put down anybody who does believe that. I was very, very, but I just was not comfortable, so.
Me neither, but I would also encourage.
But I respect that belief. I think the problem here is our culture is so steep into categories, and because it's quite easy to judge another person. And I think that I believe that Hashem, God, whatever you want to call him, is that it's the oneness that's very important to me. And that, like you said, I think we have to respect that person, and not judge them, Does that make sense?
Makes
So I
perfect sense.
learned that a lot
So
while I was
I get the
there.
question. Let me tell you what I think. First of all, I want to encourage us always to be suspicious about
Right.
the word authentic,
Mhm.
right?
Okay.
Everything changes over time.
Mhm.
Judaism looks different today than it did 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 500 years ago, 2,000 years ago. Authenticity is maybe not the metric. Certainly, there are plenty of Jews alive today for whom praying at grave sites is part of their Judaism. And there are other Jews like you and me for whom we don't like that and think yuck.
Yeah.
For many Jews like you and me, a kind of hardcore monotheism is very much at the core of our Judaism. But anybody who's ever studied any part of Kabbalah and talking about Shekhinah and God's presence and the Sfirot, different attributes of God or different emanations of God or different parts of God, well, it's not so different, 3, 10, I don't know, right? And so I just think that we have to be careful about our orthodoxies. And when it comes to respect, I think so many of us, because of the legacy of anti-Semitism and Christian anti-Judaism, are instinctively, we want to stay away from New Testament texts. But that's part of why I think that we should engage with them and engage with them as Jews. And I think that, as you say, a great deal of we should have respect. I think, despite the fact that there are many ways in which we fundamentally disagree with Christian theologies, doesn't mean that we can't acknowledge and respect things. I'll tell you one story in this context. When I was in rabbinical school, Michal Springer, who was the dean at that time, knew I was going to go do a PhD and knew I was a very sort of intellectual type. And she made me do an 8-week chaplaincy rotation at Bellevue Hospital in New York City, where I had to go minister to the mentally ill and the afflicted and right? It was the weirdest thing I've ever done. But I was really struck by a patient who said, "Rabbi, I know I'm dying, but I'm not afraid because Jesus is right there in the chair with me and Jesus is going to be with me while I die. And so I'm not afraid." Now, I don't believe in Jesus, right? And I don't really believe in such an immanent God. Jews don't talk about it. Oh, God's sitting in the chair right there. It's not really part of my culture, but I was profoundly moved by this, right? And thought, wow, that's a beautiful thing that somehow this person's faith is enabling them to face death without fear. That's beautiful. Right? And I'm almost sort of jealous, right, that we don't have that. I'm not asking us to adopt that, right? But I think that sometimes when you study the theologies of somebody else and study the text of somebody, that you can have profound respect and admiration and maybe even jealousy for things that aren't part of your tradition. And I think that's good. And so I want to encourage us, as we're studying texts which aren't exactly part of our own tradition, although they kind of are, given where they come from and when they were written, to have that kind of respect for other people. Let's take one more question before we call it a night. Anybody else? Yeah, go ahead.
It's, if there's time and no one else has a question, but it's not on this topic. It's because you're now someone I want to ask this question of longstanding. Is that okay?
Sure, go for it.
All right. So I don't know how many years ago, maybe even 20 years ago, I was teaching a particular text and I really thought about it. And where I came out was that it didn't make sense to me that there were, quote, 10 lost tribes. I thought there were only 9. I understand why the 10, because Psalms and 10's a good number, but number 1, geographically, Shimon's gone. We know Shimon's going to be gone. Shimon's absorbed into Judah. And even if it weren't, how during the divided kingdom did Shimon send the tribute all the way up to the north and Dan is ridiculous. Then there's the symbolism of the ripped robe and 1 piece, never 11 pieces, not 12. So I came up with, when I thought about it, I'm looking at my document, 8 different possible, not probable, of who that the 10th missing mystery tribe might be if it's not Shimon. And whenever I have a chance, I ask a scholar. So given that we have a few more minutes, no one else has a question, it just seemed to me you'd be a wonderful person to ask and weigh in.
It's a good question. I really don't know. I think the way I'll respond is to some degree to say something like what I said about these texts, is that if we study the Gospels in this way, as texts written as theology texts, not at the time of the events they describe, but afterwards, trying to articulate a theology for their own listeners, using the past to talk about the present, I think Jewish Bible texts are the same, largely the same thing. Maybe sections of Isaiah and Ezekiel and Jeremiah and others of the minor prophets are really old. But many of these texts are much more recent than they purport to be. And therefore, trying to use them for historicity, I think, is to some degree missing the point. That so many of these texts about the events of the 8th century weren't written until the 5th or the 6th century BCE, in which case they probably don't have a lot of historical data about the precise tribal affiliations of the people who were destroyed by the Assyrians in the 8th century. But they're not writing about the 8th century, they're writing about their own times and thinking about theologically for their own times. That might account for some of the issues that you're pointing at. But I'm not a biblicist. You have to know a little bit about the Bible to be a Talmudist, but it's not really my area of expertise. But it's a good question.
One question.
Yes, Carol, go ahead.
To go through it. Do you ever read the Zohar? I mean, and I like Reslaw in some ways. I do. He does say some good things.
Yes. I think among the ways that I differ from some traditional Jews is that I recognize that the Zohar is a medieval text, right? It's a product of the 13th century. Yes, this really fits in very nicely to what I'm trying to say. If you live in the 13th century and are making claims about the mystical truth of God, right? It makes a lot of sense to try to argue, oh, I found an ancient book. I found a 1,000-year-old book, and here it is. But the Zohar contains Spanish words. It quotes Maimonides.
Yes, it does.
Zohar is a 13th century text. When do I think it's a profound meditation on how a human being and how a Jew can address God? Absolutely. But do I think that it is Talmudic in origin and therefore has the authority as a halachic text like the Talmud? No, I don't.
No, I understand.
And so that's what I have to say about that. Elliot, you get the last word.
Yes, just a quick question. I hope this isn't too personal, but I've heard rave reviews about you in terms of your work at the Catholic College and how much the students love you. What do you do to engender respect among them, rapport? How do you? What have you done to result in such high praise of you among these non-Jewish students in a Catholic context?
Well, so thank you. I don't know who's saying such nice things about me. I guarantee you that there are others who say less nice things about me or who are offended by me or things like that. So I don't know exactly. I do think that that I try to take religion seriously. And also try to convince them that the study of religion is really a way to think about the world. In order to study religion, you have to keep an open mind. You have to be able to consider and take seriously opposing and contradictory viewpoints. You have to read texts in close ways. You have to know something about history. You have to know something about language. You have to know something about philosophy and economics and all kinds of things. And so I think that the study of religion in some ways is sort of a microcosm of the humanities as a whole. And these are students who think they're going to college because it'll help them get a job. And maybe that's true, but that's not why I think a person should go to college. I think a person should go to college to become a more thoughtful human being. And I think the study of religion is the best way to teach yourself how to think about things. And so I think, you know, sort of 18 to 22-year-olds who get pushed by their professors to think and to learn to think in new and different and exciting ways are bound to be excited about that. And I try to model for them a way of being both committed to my own religious tradition and deeply ensconced in my own rituals and community, and also be a person of the world and person who's sort of engaged with all kinds of other ideas. And I think that's something that contemporary Catholics really yearn for. Because they too love their own tradition and love their communities, and also want to be part of the world. And so I think sometimes studying about somebody else's religion, as we're doing ourselves here, can sort of give people the kind of insight to take some of that approach back to their own communities.
Do you have time for one more quick question?
Sure, go ahead.
Sure. I suspect you might have, or at least you know about it if you haven't interacted personally with her, Amy Joy Levine,
Yes.
who I believe is head of a Jewish woman who
Yes.
is she's head of New Testament studies at Vanderbilt. Any
Yes.
comments about her?
Yes, and I think, you know, if you don't own a New Testament, I think that the Jewish annotated New Testament, which she helps to edit, is an excellent version, because it's largely doing what we are doing, which is trying to situate these texts in their Jewish context or something like that. There's now it's become a sort of, there's now the Jewish annotated Apocrypha, and she is maybe among the first, but this is now a trend in which Jewish scholars are those who themselves are confessionally Jewish become scholars of New Testament. The other way around is true as well, and has been true for some time, right? There are Christians out there who become scholars and professors of rabbinic literature. And I think this kind of cross-pollination is really, really important. Once upon a time, the study of rabbinic texts was sort of in one department, right, in Near Eastern languages and civilizations, and the study of New Testament was always in theology departments, and they never talked to each other. Christine Hayes, I'm not sure to what degree Christine Hayes identifies as Christian. That's but certainly it's not. Sorry,
she does. She's a churchgoer.
Well, I know Chris pretty well. She was my advisor at Yale. Oh
wait, I didn't actually know that.
But regardless of Chris's own identity, whether we're talking about her or other people, certainly I think this is among the things that it's important to remember about the university. And for example, I refuse to allow my students to call me rabbi. It's true, I'm an ordained rabbi. That's a fact. But my job is not to be their rabbi. I'm a professor, right? And to some degree, the university is a place where we all have to sort of bracket our own confessional belief structures and try to be objective in some kind of way. And I don't think there's any reason why a Jew can't be a scholar of the New Testament. I think there's no reason why a Christian can't be a scholar of the Talmud. You don't need to be a Keynesian economist in order to teach Keynes. And so you don't need to be a Marxist to teach Marx. You don't need to be a Freudian to teach Freud. And so to some degree, this is one of the beauties of the university where anybody can come, and anybody, if they develop the tools and submit their ideas to double-blind peer review, that there's no reason why that can't happen. So yes, last comment.
I want to give you a Christine Hayes fan story.
Okay, go ahead.
So as a 17-year-old, I went off to college, and I was selected there were 80 of us that were selected for this intensive humanities seminar where we studied 3 of our 4 or 5 courses were all about the history of Western civilization. And I remember being there the whole year. We did not look at one Judaic text. Can't tell you how much time we spent on the pre-Socratics, whatever.
Okay.
So as a first-year student, I wasn't in a place to advocate anything differently. But then as an alum, I went back, I talked to the dean, I did whatever, got nowhere. When Christine Hayes came in, and this particular program was, when she got involved with this program, she was the one who basically said, this is ridiculous. You cannot do a program like this without doing Judaic tests. And she introduced them, as I remember, not just to biblical, rabbinic, but also philosophical, because we didn't look at any Jewish philosophers. Right. So that's one of my many Christine Hayes fan stories.
She may well be the world's greatest living Talmudist. You should all read her books. And with that, we're going to conclude. And I will see you all next week, where we will delve even further into the sort of particulars of Messianism in this later phase of the development of Christian texts. Have a good night. Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom.